They thought they could walk all over me, but they couldn't have made a bigger mistake. What started as a quiet move into my dream property quickly spiraled into a nightmare the moment the HOA showed up, waving rules and demands like they owned the place. They tried to box me in, convinced they had the upper hand. But here's the part they never saw coming. Every wall they built around me turned into a doorway for payback. Today, while they scramble to cover their losses and explain to their board why their authority crumbled, I'm sitting back watching the fallout. And believe me, the tables didn't just turn, they flipped. When I first set foot on that patch of land, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for peace, a chance to slow down, breathe, and finally live life on my own terms. The cabin sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, tucked between towering pines and rolling hills that seemed to swallow the noise of the outside world. To me, it felt like the kind of place where stories should end, a retreat after years of grinding, a sanctuary carved out of stubborn soil and long days of hard work. The mornings there were something out of a painting. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and the fog would lift slowly off the grass as if the land itself were waking up. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun claw its way over the ridge and think, this is it. This is what I've been chasing all these years. The community around me initially appeared picture perfect. Families walked their dogs down narrow gravel roads, kids played catch in wide driveways, and neighbors waved with polite smiles as if to say, welcome, you belong here. There was a sense of order, neat lawns, well-painted fences, and streets without a speck of trash. To some, it might have looked like paradise. But beneath that polished surface, I would soon learn order had its enforcers. At the center of it all was the Homeowners Association, the invisible hand shaping every yard, every mailbox, every minor detail that gave the neighborhood its uniform shine. I noticed their signs posted at the entrance, rules tacked onto bulletin boards, and flyers slipped into mailboxes reminding residents about standards. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than bureaucratic red tape. After all, what did I care if someone wanted every lawn trimmed exactly 2 inches shorter? It wasn't my problem. However, there's a saying I wish I had taken more seriously. Peace and control rarely coexist. For all the calm that the neighborhood promised, a tension lurked just out of sight, like a storm building behind a clear horizon. People didn't just follow the rules here, they feared stepping out of line. And when I arrived with my cabin, my land, and my determination to live freely, I didn't realize how quickly I'd become their newest target. At first, I was focused on settling in, unpacking boxes, fixing up small things inside the cabin, clearing brush along the property line. It was the kind of honest work that makes a place feel yours. Each task was a step toward building the quiet, self-reliant life I wanted. However, even in those early days, there were signs that something was amiss. Neighbors who had smiled before now lingered a little too long, watching me from across the street. Conversations seemed rehearsed, carefully measured, as though no one wanted to say too much. Then came the first visit, a knock at the door that sounded too sharp, too deliberate to belong in a place so peaceful. When I opened it, I wasn't greeted by a neighbor offering a pie or a handshake. Faces met me that I didn't recognize, wearing the tight expressions of people who weren't there to welcome me, but to inspect me. They introduced themselves as members of the HOA board, though their tone carried the weight of something more like authority than hospitality. They asked questions, not friendly ones, but probing ones. How much land did I own? What were my plans for it? Was I aware of the community rules? Their words dripped with politeness, but their eyes told another story. They weren't here to help me settle in. They were here to stake a claim. Looking back, that was the first crack in the perfect picture. The moment I realized I hadn't just bought a cabin and some land, I had stepped onto a stage where every move was watched, every decision judged, and every inch of property was a battleground waiting to be drawn. At the time, I didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what was to come. I could shrug them off, wave politely, and carry on with my life. But the truth was, I had just walked into a neighborhood where control was currency, and power was enforced through rules sharpened into weapons. The storm hadn't hit yet, but I could feel the air thickening, heavy with the promise of a fight I never asked for. And soon enough, the HOA would prove just how far they were willing to go to remind me, and everyone else, who they thought really owned this place. It didn't take long for the welcome wagon visit to turn into something much darker. A week after that first knock on my door, I received an official-looking envelope tucked under my doormat. At first glance, it looked like a routine piece of mail, but the bold header across the top told me otherwise. Notice of violation. Violation? I hadn't even been here long enough to break anything. The paper was stiff, the wording sharp, and the tone unmistakably hostile. According to the HOA, my cabin's exterior didn't conform to community aesthetic guidelines. Apparently, the natural wood finish, the very thing that made the cabin feel authentic and at home among the trees, wasn't approved. They wanted it painted in one of their designated neutral shades, which, judging by the enclosed palette, meant beige, light beige, or a shade of off-white. I laughed at first. It had to be a mistake. Who in their right mind cared whether my cabin looked uniform when it sat on acres of private land at the edge of the neighborhood? But the letter was no mistake. It ended with a chilling line. Failure to comply would result in daily fines accruing until the violation was resolved. That was the first seed of tension, but it didn't stop there. Days later, another notice arrived, this time about the length of the grass along my driveway. Too long, they claimed. Never mind that it was a gravel road surrounded by wild pines. Then came a letter about improper placement of trash bins, followed by one accusing me of unauthorized modifications for installing a simple wooden gate at the entrance of my property. It was clear. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were targeting me. At night, I'd notice cars driving slower than usual past my property, headlights lingering a little too long. I'd catch silhouettes standing at the far end of the street, clipboards in hand, watching, writing, waiting. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a surveillance zone. Every small act of independence I took drew their attention. The fines piled up quickly. $50 for the paint, $75 for the grass, $100 for the gate. At first, I thought they were bluffing, empty threats meant to scare me into submission. However, the invoices arrived, each one stamped with the same warning. Failure to pay may result in legal action or a lien against your property. That word, lien, hit me like a punch. It wasn't just about rules anymore, it was about ownership. They weren't satisfied with control. They wanted leverage over the very land I had worked so hard to call mine. I tried reasoning with them. I sent letters, made calls, even attended one of their so-called board meetings, thinking maybe I could explain myself face to face. But the moment I walked into that sterile community center, I knew I was walking into a trap. The boards sat behind a long table like judges in a courtroom, papers stacked in neat piles before them. The president, a man with a permanent scowl etched into his forehead, wasted no time reminding me of the importance of community compliance. His voice was calm, too calm, like someone who enjoyed flexing authority. Each time I tried to speak, I was interrupted, redirected, or outright silenced. They didn't want a discussion. They wanted submission. By the end of the meeting, they had voted to uphold every violation, dismissing my objections with the wave of a hand. As I walked out, one of the board members leaned just close enough to mutter, "Everyone who moves here learns eventually. Some the easy way, some the hard way." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about grass, paint, or gates. It was about power. They wanted me to bend, to fall in line, to become another obedient resident too scared, to push back. But if they thought I was going to roll over, they had picked the wrong target. The petty notices and fines were bad enough, but I could have stomached those. What came next crossed a line I never thought neighbors, let alone an association, would dare to cross. It started with the fence. One morning, as I stepped outside, with my coffee, I noticed movement at the far edge of my property. At first, I thought it was utility workers or maybe a crew hired by a neighbor. But as I walked closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't workers, it was the HOA. A small team of men in reflective vests was hammering posts into the ground, stringing wire and planks across the only road that led from my cabin to the main street. They were cutting me off. I stormed down the path, demanding to know what they thought they were doing on my land. The man in charge, clipboard in hand, didn't even flinch. He told me the road was considered community access, and that the board had voted to restrict its use until I brought my property into compliance. In other words, until I bent the knee. Knew they were bluffing. That road was mine. I had the deed to prove it, but bluff or not, the fence was there, blocking me in like an animal. It wasn't just intimidation. It was entrapment. The fury burned hot in my chest, but fury alone wasn't going to solve this. I documented everything, photos, videos, timestamps. Every nail they drove into the posts was a record of their overreach. But as I stood there, camera in hand, I could feel their smirks. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me frustrated enough to make a mistake. And soon, the harassment bled into other parts of my life. A letter arrived claiming I owed thousands in back dues, even though I'd never agreed to join their HOA. Then came threats about liens, foreclosure, and forced compliance measures. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to began treating me like a pariah, whispering as I walked past, avoiding eye contact. It was as if the board had poisoned the entire community against me. But the lowest blow came on a quiet Saturday night. I woke to the sound of banging, not on my door, but on my gate. By the time I grabbed a flashlight and made it outside, whoever it was had vanished. All that remained was a spray-painted message scrawled across the wooden planks. Comply or pay. That was no longer petty bureaucracy. That was a threat. I barely slept that night, the words burning into my mind like a brand. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees set my nerves on edge. It was one thing for them to bury me in paperwork and fines. It was another to bring intimidation to my doorstep. By now, most people would have packed up and left, cutting their losses before the nightmare swallowed them whole. And maybe that's what the HOA was counting on. Perhaps they thought if they made life miserable enough, I'd sell out cheap and disappear. But I had built my life on stubborn ground. This cabin wasn't just a house. It was a home. It was freedom, independence, a hard-won slice of peace I refused to surrender. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The question was, how? I began digging, not just into their letters, but into the association itself. Public records, meeting minutes, financial filings, anything I could get my hands on. And the deeper I went, the more cracks I began to see. Their authority wasn't as ironclad as they wanted everyone to believe. Rules weren't being applied equally. Budgets didn't add up. And that fence they built? It wasn't just harassment. It was an illegal seizure of private property. Piece by piece, I was building a case. But it wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about strategy. As I continued to investigate, I realized that the HOA wasn't a fortress. It was a house of cards. And if I could find the right pressure point, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd bring the whole thing crashing down. Just when I thought I had a handle on their game, the HOA made its boldest move yet. It was a Tuesday morning when I found the envelope taped to my front door. Not slipped into the mailbox, not mailed properly. Taped there, as if they wanted me to know they had set foot on my porch, my sanctuary. The letter inside was short, but its impact was devastating. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. According to their paperwork, my failure to pay accrued fines and dues gave them grounds to initiate foreclosure on my property. In other words, they were claiming the power to take my land, my cabin, everything, over grass, paint, and a wooden gate. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was an attempt to strip me of ownership. And the worst part? I knew this was their playbook. They'd bullied others before me into submission, or worse, into losing their homes altogether. The thought of it made my blood boil. They thought they could drown me in paperwork, bury me under fake fines, and steal what I had earned. But what they didn't understand was that fear doesn't break me. It sharpens me. Still, the pressure was relentless. I'd wake up to find official vehicles idling near the edge of my property. HOA board members would park across the road, watching like vultures circling a carcass. Even the mailbox wasn't safe. Every week, another thick packet of threats and demands would arrive, each one designed to make me believe the walls were closing in. And then came the final straw. One evening, I returned home to find my driveway blocked, not by accident, not by a neighbor, but by a freshly posted "No Trespassing HOA Property" sign. They had planted it right at the edge of my land, staking their claim as if they owned the ground beneath my feet. That was it. The line had been crossed. I didn't just see red, I saw opportunity. Because here's the thing about people drunk on power. They get sloppy. They overreach. And when they do, they leave openings wide enough to drive a truck through. So instead of tearing down the sign in anger, I documented it. Photos, video, timestamp, witnesses. I collected every letter, every fine, every bogus violation they'd thrown my way. I built a wall of evidence higher than anything they could make against me, and with every piece my case grew stronger, but it wasn't just about proving they were wrong. No, I wanted something bigger. I tried to turn their arrogance against them. That's when I started crafting my counterstrike. I reached out to county offices, land surveyors, and even a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced. The road they claimed as community access wasn't theirs. The fence they built? Illegal. The foreclosure threats? Groundless. For the first time since the battle began, I felt the tide shift. But the HOA wasn't done fighting. No. Desperate people rarely retreat. Quietly. As word spread that I was pushing back, the harassment escalated. Anonymous complaints were filed against me with the county. I caught board members taking photographs of my cabin at night. And one morning I discovered nails scattered across my driveway. An accident waiting to happen. They wanted me scared. They wanted me broken. But all they did was fuel the fire. Because by now it wasn't just about protecting my cabin. It was about principle, about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation and fear. And as I looked at the mountain of evidence piled on my desk, I knew I was close to exposing them for what they really were. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And soon, the showdown would come. One that would either destroy me or kill them. The tension had reached its breaking point, and the HOA didn't even realize the trap they had set for themselves. For weeks, they had tried to push me into a corner with threats, fines, and intimidation, certain I would eventually snap or fold. But what they didn't count on was that every insult, every illegal move, and every reckless attempt to steal my property was feeding into something much bigger, a reckoning. That reckoning came to a head at the quarterly HOA meeting, the one event where every board member, every resident, and every voice in the neighborhood gathered under one roof. To them, it was a show of power, a chance to parade their control and remind everyone who really held the reins. To me, it was the stage. The community center buzzed with quiet chatter as I walked through the doors. Rows of plastic chairs faced a long table at the front where the board sat in their usual formation, stiff-backed, smug, and ready to flex their authority. The president sat in the center, lips curled into the faintest smile, as though he already knew tonight would be my undoing. But I had come prepared. When my name was called to address the board regarding ongoing violations, I rose slowly, carrying a thick folder under my arm. My steps echoed through the room, louder than the shuffle of restless neighbors. All eyes followed me as I reached the podium. At first, I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the president cleared his throat, impatiently, and gestured for me to speak. And then I began, not with excuses, not with apologies, but with evidence. I laid it out piece by piece, photos of the fence they had illegally built across my road, videos showing their board members trespassing on my land, copies of letters and fines that contradicted their own bylaws. Public records proved that the road was, in fact, part of my deeded property. Each page I placed on the podium landed like a hammer, the sound echoing through the room. At first, the board tried to interrupt, but I kept going. Every time they raised their voices, I raised the stakes. And soon, murmurs spread through the crowd of residents, neighbors who had long feared the board but had never seen someone challenge them so directly. Their whispers grew louder with each document I revealed, the tide of opinion shifting before my very eyes. Finally, I pulled out the final piece, financial records I had obtained through public filings. Numbers that didn't add up, budgets with unexplained gaps, funds allocated for community projects that never materialized. And right there in black and white was the proof. The board wasn't just abusing residents, they were bleeding the neighborhood dry for their own gain. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, disbelief. The carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling. The president slammed his gavel, demanding order, his voice shaking now with desperation. But no amount of banging could erase the truth on those pages. And as I stood there watching the panic spread across his face, I knew the balance of power had shifted for good. Still, I wasn't finished. I leaned into the microphone, voice steady, and delivered the words that sealed their fate. This isn't just a case of overreach. This is fraud. As of this morning, all of these documents have been filed with the county and turned over to the legal authorities. So the question isn't whether I'll comply with your rules. The question is whether you'll be here long enough to explain yourselves. When the investigators arrive. The silence that followed was absolute. The smugness, the intimidation, the false authority, gone in an instant. And in that silence, I realized something. The fight wasn't just mine anymore. Every resident in that room had just seen the truth. And once the truth is out, there's no putting it back in a box. The room was tense, every eye darting between me and the president. His face had gone pale. His earlier smugness had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Desperation. And desperation, I knew, was a volatile weapon. He slammed his gavel, again harder this time, rattling the table. "Order! Everyone sit down!" he barked, voice cracking as though the words were escaping him. But the residents weren't moving. They were staring, leaning forward, murmuring under their breath. For the first time, his authority no longer commanded obedience. It inspired doubt. And then he did something reckless. He pointed directly at me, accusing, shouting over the growing whispers of the crowd. "You have no right. You can't. These documents are false. You're trying to destroy this community." I held up a hand, not to silence him, but to show calm. "Everything here is verified," I said. "Every photo, every record, every claim. It's all true. And now it's public record. You made a mistake thinking fear and intimidation would silence me." The board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, realizing they had miscalculated. They had assumed no one would challenge them so boldly, that no one would take the time to gather the proof, and that the residents would stay passive. But the murmurs had grown into voices, and those voices were starting to ask questions they had never asked before. Why are we paying these fines? Why are our funds unaccounted for? Why does one resident get bullied while others are ignored? Panic flashed across the president's eyes. In a last-ditch attempt, he slammed the gavel one final time and shouted, "This meeting is adjourned." But the room didn't empty. Instead, a wave of murmurs turned into a chorus of objections. Neighbors spoke up, sharing their own experiences of harassment, threats, and intimidation. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with anger that had been simmering for years. And as each story poured out, I realized that my fight had become something bigger. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about the whole community. The president tried to regain control, his shouting rising to a near scream. "You're lying! This is slander! You will regret this!" But the evidence spoke louder than his threats. Copies of meeting minutes, receipts, and photos were already circulating. The truth was undeniable. And then the unthinkable happened. The president, in a desperate bid to reclaim authority, attempted to physically remove one of the residents who had stood to testify against him. Chairs scraped, people shouted, and for a moment chaos filled the room. But it was chaotic, as I had anticipated. Cameras were rolling. Phones were recording. Every act of aggression, every attempt to silence the truth, was documented. By the time the dust settled, the room had shifted. The president, red-faced and sputtering, was no longer the center of power. He was a man exposed, cornered by his own arrogance and the collective scrutiny of the community. I stood at the podium feeling a surge of vindication. Not because I wanted revenge, but because justice, slow, deliberate, undeniable, had arrived. I looked across the room at the faces of my neighbors, some stunned, some relieved, others quietly nodding in agreement. The tide had turned, and there was no reversing it. And then I delivered the final blow. Calmly, deliberately. From this day forward, any further attempts to intimidate or harass residents will be documented and reported immediately. The road, this land, and our community are not yours to control. Threats don't take power. It's earned through fairness, transparency, and respect. And tonight, we've all learned that the house of cards can fall, no matter how sturdy it appears. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, heavy with the weight of truth, accountability, and a shift that could never be undone. For the president, this was more than embarrassment. It was exposure, humiliation, and the first public acknowledgement that his authority was a lie. And for me, it was a turning point. Proof that preparation, evidence, and resolve could overcome even the most entrenched system of control. The room emptied eventually, but the echoes of that night lingered. Everyone had witnessed the collapse of a tyrant under the weight of his own misconduct. And as I walked back to my cabin, the sun dipping low behind the hills, I knew that the battle was won, though the consequences of exposing the truth would ripple through the neighborhood for months to come. The dust from the confrontation at the HOA meeting hadn't even settled before the neighborhood began to feel different. Where once there had been whispers of fear and submission, now there was a tangible sense of relief. Residents who had been silenced by intimidation found their voices again. I could feel the energy shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. The very next day, county officials arrived to review the documents I had submitted. They moved quickly, verifying every photo, every public record, and every financial discrepancy. The process was meticulous, as I had anticipated. Each piece of evidence I had collected was airtight. Every rule they had twisted to serve their own ends, every threat they had levied, was documented and undeniable. By the end of the week, the HOA president and several board members were forced to appear before county authorities to answer questions about the legality of their actions. Their smug confidence from the meeting had evaporated, replaced with nervousness and an air of defensiveness. They could no longer hide behind gavel strikes or authority. Every lie, every overreach was now exposed. The fallout wasn't instant. Nothing like this ever is. But slowly, as residents spoke out and officials reviewed their misdeeds, the board began to crumble from the inside. They were replaced, shuffled into positions of accountability, or removed entirely. Policies were rewritten, fines were rescinded, and rules were clarified so that no resident could be harassed over petty grievances again. The very foundation of the HOA had been shaken, and it would never be the same. As for me, life returned to a quieter rhythm, though it was never exactly as it had been before. The cabin, once a site of battle, had become a symbol of resilience. I spent mornings on the porch once again, coffee in hand, watching the sun climb over the hills. But now, I knew that the peace I felt was protected not just by solitude or land ownership, but by vigilance, preparation, and the refusal to submit to injustice. Interestingly, the fallout didn't just affect the board, it had ripple effects throughout the community. Neighbors who had been afraid to challenge the rules began advocating for themselves. Community meetings became more transparent, residents more informed and involved. The very culture that had enabled the board's petty tyrannies started to transform into one of accountability and mutual respect. And then came the unexpected financial twist. While the HOA had tried to bully me with fines, threats, and foreclosure notices, they had inadvertently created a small opportunity. The road they had fenced off, their attempt to restrict access, became the site of a temporary controlled toll system I implemented, not as revenge, but as a way to highlight the absurdity of their overreach. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same fence intended to intimidate me became a tool to demonstrate the consequences of abuse of power. Residents, amused and emboldened, began to see the humor in the situation. Local news picked up the story, fascinated by the tale of a single homeowner standing up to a tyrannical HOA and winning. Suddenly, what had been a quiet neighborhood dispute became a case study in civic engagement, property rights, and the limits of authority. But the real impact wasn't financial, nor was it just about property rights. The victory reshaped the power dynamic for the entire community. People realized that intimidation and control were not invincible. They saw that preparation, patience, and meticulous evidence could hold even the most overreaching authorities accountable. And for me, that realization was priceless. I often think back to the early days, the first envelopes, the fines, the fence across the road. At the time, it had seemed overwhelming, relentless, even personal. But in hindsight, each challenge was a step in a larger journey. Each threat forced me to dig deeper, plan smarter, and ultimately emerge stronger. The HOA president? He faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could wield power without being held accountable. He had underestimated one thing: a homeowner with resolve and evidence could topple even the most confident tyrant. And for anyone listening to this story, the takeaway is clear. Knowledge is power, preparation is essential, and no system can survive when confronted with the truth. Even now, years later, the cabin still sits at the edge of those rolling hills. The gates stand unchallenged, the driveway is open, and the community has settled into a rhythm where fairness, transparency, and communication guide decisions rather than fear. And every time I walk along the property line, I'm reminded not just of what I fought for, but of what's possible when you refuse to surrender to intimidation. Ultimately, this story isn't just about a homeowner versus an HOA. It's about resilience, strategy, and the courage to stand for what's right when the odds seem stacked against you. It's about the moment you realize that injustice thrives in silence, and that speaking up, boldly, carefully, and relentlessly, can shift the balance in ways no one anticipates. So I ask you, the viewer, if you were faced with a system designed to push you down, to make you feel powerless, would you let it? Or would you take the steps to expose the truth, turn the tables, and reclaim not just your property but your dignity? because in that quiet, sunlit cabin at the edge of the neighborhood, I learned a lesson that applies far beyond HOA disputes. Power is never given freely, but when challenged with evidence, courage, and determination, it can be returned to those who deserve it. And that ultimately is the victory I carry with me every day, not just over the HOA, but over fear itself.